December 7, 1941. 7:55 in the morning. The USS West Virginia shuddered under the first torpedo strike as mess attendant second-class Doris Miller dropped the coffee pot he'd been carrying and felt his world explode into chaos. Metal screamed against metal, water rushed through torn bulkheads, and men shouted orders that made no sense in the sudden hell of Pearl Harbor. Miller had spent 2 years serving breakfast and shining officers' shoes, forbidden by Navy regulations from touching the very weapons that might save his ship. But as Japanese dive bombers screamed overhead and another torpedo found its mark, sending tremors through the deck beneath his feet, something fundamental shifted in the 22-year-old from Texas. The smell of cordite mixed with burning oil, the taste of fear metallic on his tongue, and in that crystalline moment of decision, Doris Miller made a choice that would shatter every rule the United States Navy had written about who could fight and who could only serve. He abandoned his assigned battle station in the magazine below decks, climbed towards the chaos above, and reached for a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun he had never been trained to operate. No one aboard the West Virginia knew that morning that one man's act of defiance would not only help save hundreds of lives, but would begin to crack the iron wall of military segregation that had stood since the founding of the Republic. Doris Miller had been born into a world where the color of his skin determined the boundaries of his dreams. October 12, 1919, in Waco, Texas, the third of 4 sons born to Connery and Henrietta Miller. His father worked the land, his mother took in laundry, and young Doris grew up with calloused hands and an understanding that hard work was the only currency that mattered in a world that offered few opportunities to black men in the American South. He was a large boy, broad-shouldered and strong, who found his calling on the football field at Moore High School, where teammates called him by his middle name, Miller, a handle that stuck throughout his life. When he wasn't playing football, he worked alongside his father, learning that a man's worth came not from what others said about him, but from what he accomplished with his own 2 hands. The Great Depression had settled over Texas like a dust storm that wouldn't lift, and by 1939, with jobs scarce and opportunities even scarcer, Miller made a decision that surprised his family. He would join the United States Navy, not because he harbored any illusions about the welcome he might receive, but because the Navy promised steady pay, regular meals, and a chance to see something beyond the cotton fields of central Texas. He had no idea that his choice to enlist would place him aboard a battleship in Pearl Harbor, where history would demand more from him than any training manual had ever required. The Navy that welcomed Doris Miller in 1939 was an institution built on tradition, hierarchy, and an unshakable belief in racial separation. Negro sailors, as they were designated in official documents, could serve only in the steward's branch, preparing meals, cleaning quarters, and performing what the Navy considered menial labor. They could not operate the great guns that defined a warship's power, could not stand watch on the bridge where tactical decisions were made, and could not advance beyond the lowest enlisted ranks, regardless of their intelligence, courage, or competence. Miller reported to the USS Pyro, an ammunition ship, where he learned the rhythms of naval life, the precise choreography of morning inspections, the careful deference required when addressing white officers, and the unspoken understanding that his value to the service would always be measured in pressed uniforms and properly served meals, rather than in any contribution to the ship's fighting capability. After completing basic training, he was transferred to the USS West Virginia, one of the most powerful battleships in the Pacific Fleet, where he joined a crew of over 1,500 men in a floating city of steel that represented the pinnacle of American naval engineering. The West Virginia was a monument to American industrial might, 424 feet of armor and artillery that could hurl 14-inch shells over 20 miles with devastating accuracy. Miller's battle station, assigned according to regulations that had never been questioned, was in the magazine deep in the ship's hull, where he would pass ammunition to the gun crews above during any engagement. He would never see the enemy, never operate the weapons that defined the ship's purpose, never be asked to make the split-second decisions that determined victory or defeat. But fate, as it often does, had plans that no regulation could anticipate, and the young man from Waco was about to discover that courage knows no boundaries, and heroism recognizes no color. By December 7, 1941, the storm clouds of global war had been gathering for over 2 years, and Pearl Harbor had become the linchpin of American strategy in the Pacific. The Japanese Empire had been expanding across Asia since the early 1930s, swallowing Manchuria, invading China, and building a military machine that now threatened to dominate the entire Western Pacific. Emperor Hirohito's admirals understood that American naval power, concentrated at Pearl Harbor, represented the only force capable of challenging Japanese expansion, and they had been planning a preemptive strike that would cripple the Pacific Fleet before the United States could fully mobilize for war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied at Harvard and understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues, which made him both the perfect planner for the assault and the most worried about its long-term consequences. He famously warned that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months, perhaps a year, but that a prolonged war with the United States would end in certain defeat. The attack plan was audacious in its scope and timing, involving 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 aircraft, and a level of coordination that had never been attempted in naval warfare. The first wave would target airfields to prevent American fighters from mounting effective resistance, while the second wave would focus on the battleships moored along what sailors called Battleship Row, the heart of American naval power in the Pacific. Intelligence reports had confirmed that most of the Pacific Fleet would be in harbor on Sunday morning, December 7th, creating what Japanese planners considered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to eliminate American naval supremacy with a single, decisive blow. What they could not plan for, what no military strategist could anticipate, was how individual acts of courage and improvisation would emerge from the chaos they were about to unleash. Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor had dawned clear and calm, with the kind of perfect weather that made Hawaii feel like paradise, even to sailors who had grown tired of the routine. The Pacific Fleet was indeed in harbor. 8 battleships moored along Ford Island in the precise formation that Japanese intelligence had reported, their crews enjoying the one morning of the week when military routine relaxed into something approaching normalcy. Church services were scheduled for 1100 hours. Liberty parties were preparing to go ashore, and the ordinary rhythm of shipboard life proceeded without any hint of the approaching catastrophe. Doris Miller had risen early, as was his custom, to begin preparations for the officers' breakfast, a meal that required careful attention to detail and the kind of precise service that had become second nature during his 2 years aboard the West Virginia. He moved through the galley with practiced efficiency, measuring coffee, checking the bacon, ensuring that every aspect of the morning meal would meet the exacting standards that defined Navy life. The ship's general quarters alarm had been silent for so long that many of the crew had begun to consider it merely a training exercise, something to be endured rather than prepared for. And the possibility of actual combat seemed as remote as the snow-capped mountains visible on the distant Big Island. At 7:30 that morning, as Miller worked in the galley and most of the crew prepared for another peaceful Sunday, radar operators at Opana Point detected what appeared to be a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, but communication failures and peacetime assumptions led to a tragic misidentification that would cost hundreds of lives. The formation was dismissed as either a scheduled flight of American B-17 bombers or perhaps a training exercise, and no general alarm was sounded. At 7:49, the first Japanese dive bombers appeared over Pearl Harbor, and in the space of a few seconds, the longest period of peace in American history came to a violent end. Miller was still in the galley when the first bombs fell on Ford Island, the explosions near enough to rattle dishes and send coffee spilling across the deck, but still distant enough that many aboard the West Virginia assumed they were witnessing some kind of unusually realistic training exercise. The illusion of peace shattered at 7:56 when the first torpedo struck the West Virginia amidships with a concussion that threw Miller against the galley bulkhead and sent every loose object in the ship flying through the air like deadly projectiles. The sound was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a deep, groaning roar that seemed to come from the ship's very soul as steel twisted and water rushed into spaces that had never been designed to accommodate the Pacific Ocean. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main electrical system failed, painting everything in a hellish red glow that made the chaos even more disorienting, and Miller could hear the general quarters alarm finally sounding. Its urgent call to battle stations coming far too late to matter. He started toward his assigned battle station in the magazine, following the training that had been drilled into him through countless exercises. But as he moved through corridors that were already beginning to flood, he encountered Chief Petty Officer Frank Simmons, a man whose authority was absolute, but whose judgment Miller had learned to respect during months of working together. Simmons was struggling to carry Lieutenant Commander Mervyn Bennion, the West Virginia's commanding officer, who had been critically wounded by shrapnel from the first torpedo strike and was bleeding heavily from wounds that would prove fatal within the hour. Without thinking, without calculating the consequences of abandoning his battle station, Miller reached out to help. And in that moment of human compassion, he took the first step toward a destiny that no one could have predicted. Together, they carried the mortally wounded captain toward what they hoped would be safety, moving through passageways that groaned under the stress of structural damage and echoed with the sounds of men calling for help, for orders, for someone to tell them what to do in a situation that had never been covered in any training manual. The West Virginia was dying around them, taking on water so rapidly that Miller could feel the deck beginning to list beneath his feet, and as they reached the main deck, he realized that following orders might not be enough to save the ship or the hundreds of men still trapped below. The scene on deck was one of controlled chaos, with damage control parties working frantically to shore up bulkheads, medical corpsmen treating wounded sailors, and officers trying to coordinate a response to an attack that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Japanese dive bombers screamed overhead in seemingly endless waves, their engines creating a high-pitched whine that mixed with the deeper roar of anti-aircraft fire from ships throughout the harbor. The USS Arizona had already exploded, sending a column of smoke and flame over 1,000 feet into the air, and the USS Oklahoma was listing so severely that it would capsize within minutes, trapping over 400 sailors inside its hull. Miller helped move Lieutenant Commander Bennion to a position where medical personnel could attempt to treat his wounds, knowing even as he did so that the captain was dying and that command of the ship was disintegrating along with its structure. The normal chain of command that governed every aspect of naval life was breaking down under the pressure of unprecedented catastrophe, and decisions that would normally require authorization from multiple levels of command now had to be made by individual sailors who found themselves facing situations they had never been trained to handle. It was then that Miller noticed the .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun, its regular crew killed or wounded, its ammunition ready, but no one available to operate it. Navy regulations were clear and unambiguous. Negro sailors were forbidden from operating ships' armament, their role limited to support functions that kept them away from the tools of warfare. But Japanese aircraft were continuing their attack runs over the West Virginia, their machine gun fire stitching lines of death across the deck. And Miller realized that regulations written in peacetime might not apply to the reality of war. He had watched the gun crews during countless training exercises, had observed their movements, and understood the basic mechanics of the weapon, and as another wave of dive bombers appeared on the horizon, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life and challenge fundamental assumptions about race, ability, and courage in the United States military. Miller moved to the anti-aircraft gun with the same deliberate purpose he had always brought to his duties in the galley, his large hands finding the controls and his eyes tracking the incoming aircraft with an intensity born of desperation and determination. The weapon was a Browning .50 caliber machine gun, a fearsome piece of machinery capable of firing over 500 rounds per minute. But Miller had never received formal training on its operation, had never been considered worthy of instruction in the tools of warfare that defined a warship's defensive capability. What he had was 2 years of observation, an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems gained through a lifetime of working with his hands, and the absolute certainty that men were going to die if someone didn't start shooting back at the aircraft that continued to strafe the West Virginia's deck with methodical precision. He found the trigger, felt the weapon's massive recoil as it began firing, and watched tracer rounds streak upward toward the Japanese formation with a satisfaction that surprised him with its intensity. The sound of the gun was deafening, a rapid hammering that added to the cacophony of explosions and shouting that had transformed Pearl Harbor into something resembling the end of the world. But Miller found himself settling into a rhythm, leading the targets as he had seen the trained gunners do during peacetime exercises, adjusting his fire based on the traces he could see and the reactions of aircraft that suddenly found themselves under effective defensive fire. Japanese pilots had been told to expect minimal resistance from the Americans, most of whom would be caught completely off guard by the attack. But Miller's gun was now sending streams of .50 caliber bullets into their formation, forcing them to break off attack runs and making their bombing and strafing less accurate than planned. He had no way of knowing whether his fire was effective, no way to count the aircraft he might be hitting, or the bombs that fell harmlessly into the harbor because pilots were forced to release them early, but he could see that his gunfire was having an impact on enemy tactics, and that was enough to keep him firing until his ammunition was exhausted and his replacement arrived. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, as Miller continued to operate the anti-aircraft gun with a competence that surprised everyone who witnessed it, including himself. Japanese aircraft continued their attack runs in waves, their pilots showing remarkable skill and courage as they pressed home their attacks despite increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire from ships throughout the harbor. Miller's gun was now part of a coordinated defense that included every weapon that could be brought to bear, from the massive 14-inch guns of the battleships to small arms fire from sailors who had grabbed rifles and were shooting at aircraft from exposed positions on deck. The air above Pearl Harbor had become a killing field where Japanese aircraft had to run a gauntlet of defensive fire that grew more intense and accurate with each passing minute, and Miller found himself at the center of a battle that would determine whether the attack succeeded in crippling American naval power or merely damaged it sufficiently to delay the inevitable American response. His gun jammed twice, forcing him to clear the mechanism with a speed and efficiency that would have impressed his instructors if any had been present to observe his performance. And each time he got the weapon back into action, his fire seemed more accurate and effective than before. Witnesses later reported seeing Japanese aircraft smoking or veering away from their attack runs after passing through Miller's field of fire, but in the heat of battle, he had no time to assess his effectiveness, only the knowledge that as long as he kept firing, American sailors had a better chance of survival. The West Virginia continued to settle lower in the water, its list becoming more pronounced with each torpedo that found its mark, but Miller remained at his post, his hands steady on the gun's controls, and his eyes fixed on the sky where American and Japanese aircraft now dueled in deadly earnest. He had crossed a line that morning, abandoned the role that Navy regulations had assigned to him based solely on the color of his skin, and in doing so, he had discovered something about himself and about the nature of courage that would resonate far beyond the confines of Pearl Harbor. When the last Japanese aircraft finally disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would scar the American psyche for generations, Miller remained at the anti-aircraft gun until relieved by a white gunner's mate who stared at him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The immediate crisis was over, but the West Virginia was clearly doomed, settling so low in the water that abandoning ship was no longer a possibility, but an immediate necessity. Miller had fired the .50 caliber gun for over an hour, expending hundreds of rounds and engaging dozens of enemy aircraft, his actions witnessed by scores of sailors who would later testify to his courage and effectiveness under fire. But even as he helped with the evacuation of wounded sailors and the desperate effort to save what could be saved from the dying battleship, Miller understood that his actions that morning had created a problem that the Navy's rigid racial hierarchy was not equipped to handle. He had proven that Negro sailors could operate ships' armament as effectively as their white counterparts, had demonstrated under the most extreme circumstances possible that courage and competence had nothing to do with skin color, and had done so in front of hundreds of witnesses whose testimony could not be dismissed or ignored. The immediate challenge was survival, getting wounded men to medical facilities and ensuring that classified materials didn't fall into enemy hands if the ship was boarded. But Miller knew that eventually questions would be asked about his actions, about why he had abandoned his battle station, about whether he had acted within regulations or outside them. He also knew, with the clarity that comes from having faced death and discovered reserves of strength he never knew he possessed, that he would make the same choice again without hesitation, regardless of the consequences that might follow. The attack on Pearl Harbor had lasted less than 2 hours, but it had changed everything about America's relationship with the world and everything about Doris Miller's relationship with himself and his country. In the immediate aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, as rescue operations continued and the full scope of the disaster became clear, Miller's actions began to generate a tension that made Navy officials deeply uncomfortable. Fellow sailors who had witnessed his performance at the anti-aircraft gun spoke openly about his courage and effectiveness, their testimonies creating a narrative that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial capability and military readiness. The official casualty figures were staggering: over 2,400 Americans killed and nearly 1,200 wounded, with 5 battleships sunk or severely damaged and numerous other vessels destroyed or crippled. But amid the statistics of defeat and destruction, stories of individual heroism began to emerge, and Miller's name appeared repeatedly in after-action reports and witness statements that praised his initiative and competence under fire. The problem for Navy leadership was that acknowledging Miller's heroism meant acknowledging that their racial policies were not only morally questionable, but militarily counterproductive, that they had been wasting human resources on an enormous scale and potentially weakening their fighting capability in the process. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commanding officer of the Pacific Fleet, faced the impossible task of explaining how the Navy had been caught so completely off guard, while simultaneously dealing with questions about why one of the few bright spots in the disaster had come from a sailor who wasn't supposed to be operating weapons in the first place. The initial response was institutional confusion, with some officers recommending Miller for disciplinary action for abandoning his battle station, while others pushed for recognition of his extraordinary performance under fire. The compromise that emerged reflected the Navy's discomfort with the implications of Miller's actions, a decision to recognize his heroism while carefully avoiding any suggestion that existing racial policies needed to be reconsidered. Miller was quietly transferred off the West Virginia, which was eventually raised and rebuilt, and assigned to duties that would keep him away from the spotlight while the Navy figured out how to handle a situation that had no precedent in military history. The story of Miller's heroism at Pearl Harbor might have remained buried in classified files and forgotten by all but those who witnessed it, but the attack had created a national hunger for heroes that could not be satisfied by official denials and institutional silence. Newspaper reporters, looking for positive stories amid the overwhelming narrative of military defeat and national humiliation, began investigating reports of exceptional courage during the attack, and Miller's name kept appearing in their interviews with Pearl Harbor survivors. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential Negro newspapers in the country, picked up the story and began pressing for recognition of Miller's actions, arguing that his heroism demonstrated the patriotism and capability of Negro Americans who were being denied full participation in the war effort. Other newspapers followed suit, and within months of the Pearl Harbor attack, Miller had become a symbol of both American courage and American hypocrisy, a hero whose recognition would require acknowledgement of the very racial policies that had initially prevented him from serving in combat roles. The pressure for recognition came not only from the press, but from members of Congress who had begun asking pointed questions about military efficiency and the utilization of available manpower in what was clearly going to be a protracted global conflict. Senator Harry Truman of Missouri, who would later become president, was among those who questioned whether racial segregation in the military was compatible with the kind of total war effort that victory would require. The Navy found itself caught between its traditional policies and the political reality of fighting a war that would demand every available resource, human and material, that the nation could provide. In May of 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, the Navy took the unprecedented step of awarding Miller the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor, making him the first Negro sailor to receive such recognition during World War II. The citation praised his distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his personal safety, while carefully avoiding any mention of the racial barriers he had overcome or the policies his actions had challenged. The award ceremony took place aboard the USS Enterprise, with Admiral Chester Nimitz, the new commander of the Pacific Fleet, personally presenting Miller with the Navy Cross in front of assembled reporters and newsreel cameras. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate, a hero of Pearl Harbor being honored by the service that had initially been reluctant to acknowledge his contributions, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Miller accepted the award with the same quiet dignity he had always displayed, speaking briefly about his gratitude for the recognition and his commitment to continued service, but saying nothing about the racial policies that had initially limited his role or the broader implications of his actions for other Negro servicemen. The ceremony was covered extensively in both mainstream and Negro media, with many publications using the occasion to call for broader changes in military racial policies and greater opportunities for Negro Americans to contribute to the war effort. But Miller himself remained focused on his duties as a sailor, returning to his assigned role in the steward's branch and continuing to serve with the same competence and dedication he had always displayed. He had become a symbol of possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of official policy, proof that courage and capability could not be contained by artificial limitations, but he understood that his individual recognition did not automatically translate into systemic change for the thousands of other Negro servicemen who faced the same restrictions he had encountered before Pearl Harbor. The war was still in its early stages, the ultimate outcome far from certain, and Miller knew that lasting change would require more than symbolic gestures and individual heroism. It would require a fundamental rethinking of what America meant by equality and opportunity in wartime and beyond. Miller's post-Pearl Harbor service took him throughout the Pacific theater as the United States began its long campaign to roll back Japanese expansion and ultimately defeat the empire that had launched the sneak attack on December 7th. He served aboard the USS Indianapolis, one of the Navy's most important heavy cruisers, participating in operations that carried American forces across thousands of miles of ocean in what would become the largest naval campaign in human history. The Indianapolis served as flagship for various task forces conducting raids against Japanese-held islands, providing fire support for amphibious assaults, and engaging in the kind of high-speed carrier operations that defined naval warfare in the Pacific. Miller continued to serve in the steward's branch, his official duties unchanged despite his demonstrated competence with naval armament. But his presence aboard ship had an impact that extended far beyond his formal responsibilities. Younger Negro sailors looked to him as proof that courage and competence could overcome institutional barriers, while white sailors who had heard about his actions at Pearl Harbor began to question assumptions about racial capability that many had never examined before. His quiet professionalism and obvious competence gradually broke down barriers that existed more in custom than in regulation, and officers who might have been skeptical about Negro capabilities found themselves relying on his judgment and experience in ways that would have been unthinkable before the war. The Indianapolis participated in some of the most significant naval operations of the Pacific Campaign, from the initial raids on Japanese positions to the massive fleet engagements that gradually shifted the balance of power in America's favor. Miller was present during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, when American carrier aircraft decimated Japanese naval aviation in what pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and he witnessed the systematic destruction of Japanese naval power that his actions at Pearl Harbor had helped make possible by ensuring that American battleships survived to fight another day. The transformation of American military racial policies accelerated as the war progressed and the need for manpower became increasingly acute. But change came slowly and often grudgingly from institutions that had been built on assumptions about racial hierarchy that extended back to the founding of the Republic. Miller's recognition had opened a crack in the wall of segregation, but expanding that opening into meaningful opportunities for other Negro servicemen required sustained political pressure and the gradual realization that racial policies were hindering rather than helping the war effort. The Army began experimenting with integrated combat units in Europe, where Negro soldiers performed with distinction in some of the war's most challenging battles, while the Navy slowly expanded opportunities for Negro sailors beyond the steward's branch, allowing them to serve in general ratings where their skills could be more fully utilized. Miller's story became part of the broader narrative of wartime transformation, evidence that American democracy could evolve under pressure and that the ideals the nation claimed to be fighting for overseas could also be applied at home. But progress was uneven and often accompanied by resistance from those who believed that racial integration would undermine military effectiveness rather than enhance it. Miller himself remained largely above the political debates swirling around his recognition, focusing on his duties as a sailor and his contribution to victory over the forces that had attacked his country without warning or declaration of war. He understood that his actions at Pearl Harbor had symbolic importance, but he also knew that symbols were meaningless without substance, and that real change would require more than individual heroism. It would require institutional commitment to the principles of equality and opportunity that America claimed to represent. On November 24, 1943, nearly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, the USS Liscum Bay was sunk by a Japanese submarine while supporting operations in the Gilbert Islands, taking Doris Miller down with the ship and ending the life of a man who had proven that courage knows no color and that heroism can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Miller was 24 years old when he died, still serving in the steward's branch, Despite his demonstrated competence with naval armament, still constrained by policies that limited his opportunities while acknowledging his contributions. His death was a loss, not only to his family and shipmates, but to a nation that was slowly learning to recognize the full potential of all its citizens, regardless of race or background. The official notification to his parents in Waco was brief and formal, acknowledging his death in service to his country without mentioning the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him to national attention or the impact his actions had on American military policy. But Miller's legacy extended far beyond the official records, inspiring a generation of Negro Americans who saw in his story proof that barriers could be overcome and that patriotism was not limited by skin color or social position. His actions at Pearl Harbor had demonstrated that the military's racial policies were not only morally questionable, but practically counterproductive, wasting human resources that could have been utilized to greater effect in the war effort. The gradual integration of American military forces that accelerated after World War II owed much to pioneers like Miller, who had proven under the most extreme circumstances possible that capability and courage were not determined by race but by character and commitment. The broader implications of Miller's story extended well beyond military policy into the fundamental questions of democracy and equality that would define American society in the decades following World War II. His recognition as a hero had created a precedent that could not be ignored, evidence that Negro Americans were capable of the same heroism and sacrifice as their white compatriots and deserved the same opportunities to serve their country in whatever capacity their skills and courage warranted. The civil rights movement that emerged in the post-war period drew inspiration from stories like Miller's, using them to challenge segregation and discrimination in all aspects of American life, not just the military. Veterans who had served alongside Negro servicemen during the war returned home with first-hand knowledge of their capability and courage, becoming advocates for integration and equality in ways that peacetime arguments alone could never have achieved. Miller's Navy Cross became a symbol of possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of official policy, proof that America could live up to its highest ideals when circumstances demanded courage over comfort and principle over prejudice. The ship named in his honor, the USS Miller, became the first American naval vessel named for a Negro sailor, a recognition that would have been unthinkable before Pearl Harbor, but seemed appropriate and overdue by the time of the ship's commissioning in 1944. The vessel served with distinction throughout the remainder of World War II and beyond, carrying Miller's name and legacy into conflicts where American military forces were fully integrated and where service members were judged by their performance rather than their race. Today, more than 8 decades after Pearl Harbor, Miller's story continues to resonate as an example of how individual courage can challenge institutional barriers and create possibilities for change that seemed impossible before crisis demanded transformation. His actions on December 7, 1941, demonstrated that the traditional boundaries between who could fight and who could only serve were artificial constructs that had more to do with prejudice than with military effectiveness, and his recognition helped accelerate the integration of American military forces that became a model for broader social change. The lesson of his story is not just about racial progress, but about the power of individual action to challenge established systems and create new realities when circumstances demand courage over conformity. Miller did not set out to become a civil rights pioneer or a symbol of military integration. He simply responded to an emergency with the tools and skills he possessed. But his response revealed truths about capability and courage that could not be ignored or dismissed. His willingness to abandon his assigned battle station and operate a weapon he was forbidden to touch may have violated Navy regulations, but it saved lives and demonstrated possibilities that had been hidden by institutional blindness and social prejudice. The mathematics of heroism, as Miller proved that morning, are not calculated in regulation manuals or policy directives, but in the split-second decisions that define character and reveal the true measure of human potential. His legacy reminds us that courage is not distributed according to race or social position, but emerges from individual commitment to principles larger than personal comfort or institutional conformity. The story of Doris Miller raises uncomfortable questions about how many other opportunities for heroism and service have been lost to prejudice and institutional blindness. How many potential heroes have been relegated to roles that wasted their talents and limited their contributions to the common good? His recognition came only because circumstances forced acknowledgement of what should have been obvious from the beginning, that capability and courage are not determined by skin color, but by character and commitment to something larger than oneself. The fact that it took a national catastrophe to create opportunities for Miller to demonstrate his worth suggests that America has often been its own worst enemy, limiting its potential by limiting the potential of its citizens based on irrelevant characteristics rather than relevant capabilities. His story challenges us to examine our own assumptions about who can lead, who can serve, and who deserves opportunities to contribute to the common good, and to ask whether we are making the same mistakes today that nearly cost America the services of one of its greatest heroes. Miller's legacy is not just about military integration or racial progress, but about the fundamental question of how democracies can maximize their potential by maximizing the potential of all their citizens regardless of background or circumstance. His willingness to act beyond the boundaries of his assigned role when circumstances demanded it demonstrates the kind of moral courage that democracies require to survive and thrive in a complex and often hostile world. Would you have had the courage to abandon your assigned role and take up a weapon you were forbidden to touch when your shipmates were dying and your country was under attack? Would you have been willing to challenge institutional barriers when doing so might have resulted in court-martial and disgrace rather than recognition and honor? Miller's story reminds us that heroism often requires acting beyond the boundaries of official permission, and that the greatest service sometimes means breaking rules that should never have existed in the first place. His legacy challenges each of us to examine our own readiness to act courageously when circumstances demand it, and to ask whether we have the moral strength to do what is right, rather than what is easy or officially sanctioned. Comment below and share this story so others can remember that courage knows no color and that heroism can emerge from the most unexpected places when democracy is threatened and ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. The lesson of December 7, 1941, is not just about military preparedness or naval tactics, but about the infinite potential that exists within every human being when crisis strips away artificial barriers and reveals the true measure of character and commitment to the common good.